Hi, I'm the Space Quest historian. In this series, we're running down the various ways the Space Quest games could unfairly dick you over. Most of the times these involve soft locks or obtuse unfair puzzles, but today's episode is gonna be ever so slightly different. Space Quest V, on the whole, is a very solidly designed game that, for the most part, steers clear of the egregious design missteps of its predecessors. That's not to suggest that the previous 4 games were badly designed, though. You have to take into account the historical trajectory of these games. The first game came out in 1986 when graphic adventure games were still a new and fresh idea. It was still treading new ground, and things like game design philosophies were still something that designers were just making up as they went along, which did, in some cases, lead to some frustrating gameplay scenarios that are easy to dismiss as poor choices when viewed through a modern lens and with the hindsight of decades of refinement. Space Quest V came out in 1993, and by this time certain adventure game tropes had had a chance to gel and solidify. While Sierra didn't quite shy away from the harsh baggage of early text adventures as pointedly as their contemporary rival LucasArts did, in that the player could still die and it was indeed still possible to paint yourself into an unwinnable corner, it is fair to say that by this point they had at least softened their approach to proverbially bitch-slapping their audience at every conceivable turn. Space Quest V brought a wide palette of modern considerations to the series. For one, it gives our protagonist Roger Wilco a voice that goes far beyond the occasional quips and offhanded remarks of Space Quest IV. It also gives him a cast of supporting characters to bounce ideas off of, a cast that for the first time in the series stay with him during the duration of the adventure, as opposed to bit players that show up for a brief moment to yell at him, often at gunpoint, and then fuck off out of his life as soon as you complete their sections, never to be seen again. Second, and most important to this video, they all but completely eradicated the possibility of getting yourself stuck in a dead-end situation, to the point where you really have to go out of your way to find yourself cock-blocked for the rest of eternity. That's not to say Space Quest V is devoid of dick moves, but they are few and far between, especially when compared to the absolutely savage amount of priapic face-slapping that its nearest predecessor Space Quest IV could dish out. While that game had you bend over and assume the position with such startling frequency that it felt like a prolonged BDSM session with a particularly vicious dominatrix who would ignore your safe word at every turn, Space Quest V opts for a more silly, cartoonish approach where much of the danger is telegraphed way in advance and the potential for soft locking is practically non-existent. Most of the challenge in Space Quest V comes from working out what the hell the game wants from you, because it does have a habit of dumping you into a situation with little to no direction. The first time you arrive on the abandoned colony of Clorox 2, the game not only throws you into a new location to explore, but your companion immediately fucks off under the pretense that hanging around with your ass would be bad luck. This is still letting the player off light because there's only really 2 screens to explore and you're not in any immediate danger when you first arrive. The same can't be said for when you're trying to dodge a killer android out for your blood on the scenic planet with the unfortunate and ominous name Kiss Your Ass Goodbye. Here, working out what you're meant to do involves walking blindly across multiple screens, and the vast majority of them only give you precious few seconds to explore before the android shows up to perforate your ass. And the sequence itself is fairly complicated, involving numerous steps that have to be performed in a specific sequence, and is pretty much a case of trial and error until you work out that what the game expects you to do is knock this branch off a tree, use the branch to knock the android off this waterfall with a huge boulder, then procure a banana-shaped fruit off of this other tree, and then shove it up her ass. I mean jetpack. It's one of those things where the whole thing makes perfect sense when you can finally step back and assess the situation after you've successfully completed the sequence, but it's an absolute mad dash to try anything and everything in the thick of it while under an extremely strict time limit. One of the game's favorite tricks to pull on you is to change up the formula from your standard bread and butter inventory-based gameplay and throw new and unexpected mechanics at you, again usually with a strict time limit that results in instant game over if you don't work out this new mechanic fast enough. I said you weren't in any immediate danger when you beamed down to this aforementioned abandoned colony, and the key word there is immediate, because it turns out it's not quite as abandoned as it appears at first glance. Once you start poking around a bit, you're suddenly accosted by this lovely gentleman with a peculiar skin condition, and now you're meant to dodge his corrosive spitballs by clicking to the left and right of Roger's head. Never mind that the angle of the graphics makes it nearly impossible to work out which direction the spit is coming from until you realize the trick is to just wait for the spitball to drop before moving your head, but the mechanical shift itself is so startling and you have no time to get to grips with it before you've already taken your first loogie to the face. Similarly, the crest cleaning minigame at the start of the game has you fuck around on this little mini scooter trying to scratch and sniff the StarCon emblem into pristine condition, and while that mechanic is certainly easier to work out than most of the other gameplay shifts, the game is very strict about you having to clean absolutely every inch of this fucking thing, and if you miss even one single pixel before the stingent timer runs out, you're once again rewarded with a one-way ticket to the pearly gates. The worst offender by far is the EVA mission, where you're meant to rescue your chief engineer who's floating around in space like the total dumbass that he is. First of all, getting in this thing without finding an extra oxygen container in the airlock is an instant death sentence, because you will run out of oxygen long before you have a chance to even get close to Floaty McFuckface here. Even with the extra oxygen, the timer here is still strict to the point of being unforgiving, because you've also got a fuel gauge to worry about. The controls in this hunk of shit take some getting used to, and if you fuck around for too long, you won't have enough juice to return to your ship, even if you do manage to scoop up this bumbling little prick. That's assuming you even get that far, because even if you do manage to get to grips with the controls fairly quickly, the precision with which you have to maneuver this fucking thing into range before it'll let you grab him and haul his dumb ass back to your ship is so absurdly tight that you can practically have the EVA pod lodged halfway up his ass and still not be within reaching distance. In terms of puzzle design, the game does have a few dirty tricks up its sleeve. While it draws the line at outright soft-locking you, as in putting you in a dead janitor walking situation where it's still chucking away merrily despite having painted you into an unwinnable corner, it has no qualms about forcing you to replay vast chunks of the game if you forgot to pick something up or write something down along the way. Most people who have played this game are already probably thinking of the keycard puzzle at the genetics research lab, and yes, that one is fairly infamous. At the start of the sequence, Roger turns into a fly, thanks to a transporter malfunction, and while he's in this minuscule state, you can fly through this keycard scanner to get to the inner laboratory. You're meant to write down the sequence of these laser beams in the locking mechanism, because you'll need that sequence later to construct your own makeshift keycard once you've returned to human size. Now, there's no way to shrink back down and take another look at the mechanism at this point, so if you weren't paying close attention, you are indeed shit out of luck. But at least the game gives you 3 attempts to get it right, which is frankly an astonishing amount of mercy to show for a Space Quest game. And if you fuck it up 3 times, the game just straight up kills you and tells you point blank that you should have written down the fucking sequence when you were a fly. The puzzle solution doesn't even change between playthroughs, so it's the same sequence every time you play. Less forgiving is the shit with the cloaking device. After you've defeated the killer android, you're meant to teleport back down to the planet and swipe the cloaking device from her ship. Brief honorable mention here to the safe lock mechanism that houses the cloaking device itself, which can go to fucking hell, because once again, it's just trial and error until you get it right, and once again, it's on a fairly strict timer. But it's also perfectly possible to skip this bit entirely and go on with the game without the cloaking device in your possession, until much later when you're meant to cloak your ship to avoid detection from the main baddie's battle cruiser, and if you don't have the cloaking device by this point, you are totally fucked. That part happens way later in the game. The killer android bit is one of the first things you do in the game, and cloaking your ship is one of the last, so if you fuck this up, you basically have to replay the entire fucking game. Likewise, forgetting to pick up the canisters of liquid nitrogen in the abandoned science lab is also a cruel trick that only comes back to haunt you several hours later when you're right at the end of the game, and that includes having navigated the unforgivably tedious air duct maze aboard the Goliath, which is something even the most seasoned adventure game player would wish they only had to do once in their entire lifetime. Not getting the liquid nitrogen means that once you get out of the maze, your killer android, who has now been reprogrammed to act as your science officer, will be unable to incapacitate the mutated crew of the Goliath, and you will be killed on the spot. Like I said, none of these situations will result in you being trapped in a purgatory state of playing the game without ever being able to finish it. The game will always reward your oversights with just straight up killing you, but the time it takes between committing said oversights and suffering the consequences is really fucking long, to the point of being nearly unforgivably cruel. But there's one part of this game that's always managed to annoy the piss out of me more than anything else, and it's such a trivial little moment that I really shouldn't be this mad about it, but I am. At one point late in the game, you rescue Beatrice Wankmeister, a plucky ambassador who is destined to become your future wife and give birth to your son, who in turn travels back in time to save your ass in Space Quest 4, so if she dies, that means your son is never born, and that means you'll be dead long before Space Quest 5 starts.
Everybody got that? Good!
Consequently, if anything happens to her in the course of this game, it's an instant game over. So when she happens to get splattered with the mutating goo and is about to transform into one of these slobbering splat monsters, you have to stick her in cryogenic stasis to slow down the mutation and give you time to find a cure. And here's where the dick move comes in. If you click on the cryo tube, Roger opens it. Obviously, this is bad since she's still frozen, so of course you want to close it back up. But if you click the hand icon on the tube again, expecting Roger to close it, instead he picks up Bia and pulls her out of the tube, causing her to instantly disintegrate into a pile of fleshy ice cubes, and that's it, you're dead. Waving the hand icon anywhere near this fucking cryotube is therefore a major hazard because there is no way to close it back up if you've accidentally opened it. If you leave it open, Beatrice will just defrost and turn into a goo person. If you try to close it, Roger instead does a complete dumbass move that's completely unavoidable and sends you straight into the game over screen. This is one of those times where you as the player desperately longs for the days of parser games where you could actually instruct Roger directly to just close the fucking thing instead of doing the most absurdly idiotic thing imaginable, and it absolutely pisses me off because it's such an easy thing to do offhandedly. Maybe you just want to check to see how she's doing, but if you want to get into a close-up and check on her, you have to click the look icon on her, which you would assume would just give you a general description of the cryotube, but no. It's not even what I would consider an intentional dick move. It was probably more of an oversight that no one bothered reporting and testing because they assumed it was just meant to work like this. But why? Why would you even think to haul her ass out of the tube while she's still frozen? I mean, obviously, when looking back on the solution to the actual puzzle, it's easy to see why it is the way it is. I mean, later in the game, you're told to stick her on the transporter pad and beam the goo out of her into space, which means you have to unfreeze her and then take her out of the tube and put her on the transporter pad. And this is also where you're most likely to yank her out of the tube prematurely, because this is when you're actually required to go into that aforementioned close-up and activate the tube's defrost mode before opening it up. So, from a programming standpoint, it's obvious that they coded the hand icon to perform the action of actually opening the tube and taking her out, and they probably thought it would create some sort of interactive dissonance if the hand icon was used to both get into the close-up to defrost her and also to open up the tube and get her out. But hey, here's an idea! How about just making the tube fucking voice activated? You could have used the talk icon to do the whole frost and defrost thing and then had the hand icon do the open and pull out action. That way the player wouldn't be expected to rewire their brain and remember that in this very specific instance, the look icon didn't actually provide a description of the tube like it does with every other object in the game, but instead shows you the close-up of the tube. Yes, I know that was nitpicky as all hell, but seriously, this still managed to trip me up every time I play the damn game, and I've played this game probably a million times by now. Anyway, on the whole though, Space Quest V is pretty light on outright dick moves, but that doesn't mean there isn't a callous mean streak lurking under the cutesy Saturday morning cartoon veneer of its presentation. It's a little known fact that while Scott Murphy was typically the one to write the gloriously sarcastic death messages that accompanied your fatal failures in the first 4 games, he wasn't actually the one who conjured up most of these scenarios. In fact, Mark Crow was usually the one who came up with the main stories and set pieces of these games, and Mark is, well, there's no other way to say this, he's a bit of a fucking sadist sometimes. And while some of the hair-pullingly egregious dick moves I've mentioned in previous videos about the other games in the series were the result of unintentional game design snafus, believe it or not, it never occurred to them that players might get stuck on the laser beam puzzle in Space Quest 1 because they didn't pick up the glass shard in front of the escape pod. A lot of them were also intentional, and they most likely came from the cruel and twisted mind of Mr. Crow. It's important to note that the two guys were never fans of soft-locking the player. They didn't want to be unnecessarily cruel. They wanted the player to have fun, but they certainly weren't above being playfully sadistic, and that tendency is clearly out in full force in Space Quest V, which Mark helmed solo. But Space Quest V is also an example of a point in time when designers were starting to be more cognizant of some of the cardinal sins of adventure games. Stuff like soft-locking the player and leaving them in an unwinnable state is never fun, and Space Quest V takes considerable care to avoid these scenarios, making sure that any screw-ups were punished by death and a game over screen, rather than an eternity spent wandering the game world with no prospect of ever seeing it to the end. Space Quest VI would even go so far as to diminish the dire consequences of death itself by giving you a try again button instead of expecting you to keep save games along the way, but that's a tale for the next episode where I'll be taking a look at the dick moves of Space Quest VI. Until next time, I'm the Space Quest Historian, and fuck you, not again. I'll see you around the Chrono Stream. Bye!